And we're live. Hello and welcome to Breaking Culture Live. I'm your host, Sean Johnson Andrews. I'm the immediate past president of the Cultural Studies Association, and I'm broadcasting from Chicago. We're really pleased to welcome Sandra Jeppesen, Emily Flaubert, Christopher C. Peterson, and Ewith Hazel Uthiane, who are here to discuss their latest monograph from Routledge, The Political Economy of Alternative Media. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Sandra Jeppesen
Thank
is
you.
the professor of media, film, and communications in Interdisciplinary Studies department at Lakehead University, Canada, co-founder of the Media Action Research Group and Research Center for Sustainable Communities. Her recent books include The Political Economy of Alternative Media, The Capitol Riots, Digital Media, Disinformation, and Democracy Under Attack, and Transformative Media, Intersectional Technopolitics from Indymedia to Black Lives Matter. Thanks so much for joining us, Sandra.
Thanks for having us.
Emily Flaubert, it is Flaubert, right?
Yeah,
Faubert. Faubert. I apologize. Emily Faubert is a PhD student at University of Toronto's Faculty of Information, investigating how discourses of accessibility are weaponized by companies to develop and disseminate invasive data collecting technologies, and envisioning disability justice-based approaches that approach technology with crip and mad-informed wisdoms. Emily works on democratic reform, policy research, and activist education with Apathy is Boring and the Center for Family Equity. Emily is co-author of the Political Economy of Alternative Media and has been published in Societies, Triple C, and the Thai. The Thai? The Thai.
Hi,
Thank
yeah.
you. Great to meet you, Emily. Thanks and welcome. Christopher Peterson is a PhD student in communication and culture at the Creative School at Toronto Metropolitan University. He holds an SSHRC Canadian Graduate Scholarship and has received the Dallas Smythe Award from the Union for Democratic Communications for his paper on therapy tech in the surveillance smart city. His interdisciplinary research interests examine the intersections between nostalgia, semiotics, technology, and social justice, specifically focusing on how identity and subjectivity shape our interpretation of culture and how culture consumption shapes how we form and perform our identity and subjectivity. Greetings, Christopher.
Thank you very much, Sean.
And finally, Iowith Hazel Uthihane is an academic, artist, and poet studying for a PhD at Toronto Metropolitan University in Communications and Cultural Studies. They have published a monograph with Dio Press titled The Witch, A Pedagogy of Eminence, and have recently completed a Yale Let's Lead Fellowship. Their research focuses on horizontal communication in power relations and outsider epistemologies, attempting to understand information systems through land-based methods. Thanks for being here, Iwith. And thanks to all of you for the work you've done producing this rich and productive text. In your introductory chapter, you mentioned that this was a long process of production through the Media Action Research Group, or MARGE. And in many ways, it seems like this book itself is a product of an alternative media process, though it's ultimately published by Routledge. Can you say a bit about this process and how it relates to the work you produced and maybe this taxonomy that you have?
So I can jump in with that. So we work in a horizontal collective, and Marge is larger than the group here, and also has taken place over a longer period of time than since 2013 when we started. And we work in the same ways as some of the groups that we interviewed. So we use activist processes and to kind of create horizontal practices and to create sort of experiences of equitability. But we're also within a university structure, and it was Iowith actually who studied this particular structure of like a hybrid horizontal vertical structure. So I don't know if you want to say more about that.
Yeah, well, so that is basically organizations that are sort of sandwiched inside of an organization, like a sort of nested structure. So you can have sort of layers of different processes operating at the same time that can switch off depending on who's really mediating what particular process. So you can have people dip in who are more of a, from a hierarchical perspective, like administrators or people administering finances and stuff like that. And then you can have a sort of commons that where decision-making processes can be more equitably distributed, and it sort of varies per organization, but the ultimate thing is like an institution like a university has its own methods of governing structures within it. So you have to, when the buck stops there in a certain way. So it's always an interesting process trying to mediate those structures.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so I want to come back to that structure and how it fits into your taxonomy. But I want to just talk for one moment about a key concept in your framework. You have this taxonomy, and it's developed around what you say are four key dimensions of political, economic, media power, and most of these will be familiar to scholars in the field, especially those dealing with ownership structures and technological and financial resources. But you say that it is the alignment of these, you're kind of looking across all of these different models, the alignment of these with what you call the media imaginary that's most important for the sustainability of the projects. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about this concept of the imaginary and how it fits into the taxonomy that you've developed.
So the idea of the media imaginary is that people come to their media activism work with a particular kind of understanding of what they want and what they think the media that they're getting involved in can do and what it can achieve and how they can achieve that. And they often oppose, so we've called this an alternative media imaginary, but it's often opposed sort of on a broader scale to mainstream media imaginaries, which are very corporate. But alternative media imaginaries are not all the same. And so when we started trying to think about the structure, how different projects structure themselves, it turned out that there were a whole bunch of different imaginaries, whether people want to create a media collective that ultimately is a job where they're making enough money to live on, or whether they, at the opposite end of things, want to have nothing to do with money in their media collective and think that that's kind of a bad idea, and everything in between. And so we started to see that these different media imaginaries really shaped how people structured their projects. And then if they could, and the media imaginary also has to do with their values. So how they put their kind of underlying values and ideologies and so on into practice would determine whether the project kind of worked out or not. And if you had competing imaginaries, then you get a lot of friction, a lot of tensions and contradictions. If anyone else wants to add to that, but that was kind of how we started thinking about being able to understand whether the projects were functioning the way that they intended to.
Yeah, go ahead. Someone? No? Well, so in many cases, I mean, and it's about being in alignment, right? So the sustainability of that project is kind of determined by, or it's really fundamental to the sustainability if it's aligned, if you have an alignment between the media imaginaries or the imaginaries and the everyday practices of that media organization. And one of the things that it comes up a lot, and I think it's kind of key to the intersectional dimension that kind of runs through the work, is that you mentioned there's a goal within a lot of these media of either or organizations of either creating media or using kind of decision making or authorship processes that are generally pushing back against white, cis, heteronormative, patriarchal, capitalist, ableist, imperialist, colonialist, imaginaries. And would you say that this is a common imaginary of the alternative media sphere, kind of in general, or was it just one of the indexes that kind of helped you to find the projects that were included in the study?
I think there's like a number of overlapping things. Like, firstly, we are quite interested in those kind of questions as people and researchers. And then you have a lot of overlap in these sort of like activist communities that would build these kind of projects, right? And like what kind of people get involved, and then what their political and personal interests are. And so you tend to find that there is this kind of at least dialogues happening, because you are in a lot of ways focusing on power and speaking back to power and communicating in this ecosystem where you have to struggle to survive and get your message across, and it can be somewhat adversarial and there's a lot of stressors. And then you're also needing to access communities being affected by the sort of global precarity and like different sort of like class struggles. And so you need to have access. So if there's no awareness of that at all, that becomes a little bit difficult to maintain those relationships. And so you tend to see it, but it's not something that's necessarily going to be overarching to all organizations. It really depends on their makeup, their interests, and again, yeah, what imaginary it is that's driving them in terms of purpose, I think. But
Sure.
anyone else have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, even within the organizations, there's like a lot of contradiction where people are they're they're trying to challenge the power and trying to work collectively, but at the same time they're defaulting to capitalist logics. So it's like we can't help it because we're all raised in capitalism. So they're deep, the ideas are deep inside of us. So people start to put themselves forward without realizing. And even though you're trying to create an imaginary and like a shared understanding, when stressors and anxiety builds up, that's when these capitalist logics start to take over. And then you get these power conflicts within these organizations. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we describe each of the different typologies. But
Yeah, and you know, capitalist, patriarchal, white supremacist, that, you know, all of these kind of fundamentally organizing ideologies sprout back up, and not just because they're ideological, but they're very material, right? Well, so let's talk about this taxonomy, because the taxonomy is really the the crux of the project. It seems that you've looked at across, and I didn't count up how many different media organizations you looked at. I don't know if anyone has the number off the top, but it's you know, it seems like it's close to, you know, dozens of
It's
organizations that you've. What's that?
38.
38.
Sorry,
Okay.
38 organizations and 80 interviewees in total. So
Okay.
we,
Thank you.
interviewed multiple people in some of the groups.
Yeah, and so it's but what you've ultimately kind of synthesized this down into is a set of 6 different models that you say help to describe how these different uh, I guess indexes of political economy, and especially around funding and around how the organizations operate. So I was hoping I could trouble you to give us an overview of these models and maybe just an example of one of them. Um, so
should we go in order?
Probably.
yeah, I think
Okay.
yeah. Go ahead, Chris.
So I did the chapter on critical entrepreneurial journalism. And so just to give a little background, what entrepreneurial journalism is, kind of journalism within the capitalist model, working within those, you know, mainstream kind of structures. But critical entrepreneurial journalism is kind of challenging that. And so there's when it comes to professionalization, there the interviewees that we talked about how there's these two conflicting schools of thought, where some viewed professionalization as a status, like accepting the symbolic order to gain like audience respect and financial compensation. And then there's the others that understood that professionalization is kind of a system of structural domination and authority over the disenfranchised and marginalized. So there's this like contradiction in there. And so there's also like when it comes to like individual, like there's people try when you're working as a journalist and you're trying to you kind of envelop this like um, achievement subject where like you're trying to be open, but there's this the kind of the old way of thinking about how journalism used to run is you had kind of in like a disciplinary model where you worked for a boss and then you
Sure.
always have to like, do what the boss kind of told you. They gave you assignments and you had to kind of follow that. But in critical entrepreneurial journalism, you're a little bit more open and kind of a freelancer. But the problem with that is that you become an achievement subject because you internalize the disciplinary society. So you start like putting like all the pressure that you used to feel as from a boss. Now you have that internalized. So you put it onto yourself. So you even know like you think being a freelancer, you're going to have all this freedom to do what you want, but then like you are also restricting yourself. And Byung-Chul Han talks about this in the Burnout Society, where he talks about like what happens is you get this fatal dialectic that it changes freedom into coercion. So so that's kind of at the core of what we were looking at with critical entrepreneurial journalism. One of the groups that we interviewed, which is a good case study, was Athens Live. And Athens Live in Greece, they saw after 2008 and the financial issue there, like there was a lot of the mainstream news kind of monopolized and became like very consolidated within like corporate bounds. And in 2014, 2015, this group saw that there was a gap in the mainstream news and that there was a lot of like international news that was talking about what was happening in Greece, but there was nothing really locally that was like on the ground, like talking about it. So there was this magazine that was like a culture and lifestyle magazine called Propaganda. And this small group of people decided to, a few co-founders decided to try to create a news outlet that that can kind of challenge the mainstream news and the international news within the local community there. So they basically used the same building and they found there was a floor that was open, so they just moved a bunch of desks in and then they just became journalists. They just started doing it. And they first started to do blogs and video, I think, trying to dispel some of the myths that mainstream news was saying, which was just basically reflecting the international news. And so that's kind of where Athens Live kind of formed. And
And
to
they're
this
still
day.
around.
Yeah.
That's something I'm going to ask later. Is this how many of these are still around? But the I guess one of the key things there is that they still were working on a similar kind of funding model, or they had advertising. So this is what makes it
Yeah.
the critical entrepreneurial element. So they're still working in a similar framework as a sort of capitalist uh, news gathering organization.
Yeah. But they were funded by Propaganda,
Mm,
which was like doing the culture and lifestyle magazine. And then they used some of that funding to start Athens Live. And
okay.
Propaganda, they were open to having these type of stories. And so they welcomed them and were open to helping them out.
So propaganda supported them by providing the space, but they didn't give them money specifically.
No.
So in that sense, they were resourced by propaganda. They got all their money through crowdfunding and donations. They, so that's how they managed to sustain themselves. But so they're entrepreneurial in the sense that they want to be a startup that is successful financially, and they can support themselves and make a living. That's kind of where the entrepreneurial piece comes in, but they are not structured like a mainstream media organization in terms of their funding. They work as a collective, so they don't have an editor and a owner and all that kind of traditional mainstream structure. Sorry to jump in. I'm the one who interviewed them, so I have a little more insight into that relationship, especially with propaganda.
Well, and that I guess one of the other features there is that they wanted to definitely get paid, right? Or they were trying to make sure that the authors got paid, that this was the way that would be sustainable, as if the authors were getting paid. And so that's another kind of common feature then. Well, so the next set is more like your set of projects, right? Or your project. This is the horizontal vertical hybrid.
Yes.
And so what say something about this model and how common it is.
This is like incredibly common, and is a way that's, I think, a little bit more accessible and understandable for people, in terms of, this is like a lot of our projects under this heading were either like community radios at universities, or labs, specifically labs studying, and making media for sort of grassroots purposes. So like going in and being part of communities and then creating technological infrastructures. And so depending on their specific relationship to the institution and the people inside of the organization, that would sort of determine how people were getting paid or whether they were getting paid. So like, as we know, in a lot of community radio, either you're not getting paid at all, or you are paying to access to the resources by having a membership. And so there is a bit of, within this model, there is a little bit of like tension that comes from the stratification. So you have people at different layers of power and access to the institutional resources and levers, in terms of like decision making. So you'll have like usually a sort of commons where people are on the same level, but I think specifically at places like CKUT, they had like different boards they were trying to sort of pass the power around to different sort of like governing bodies, so that it wasn't just like one person. But there's always this trade-off in terms of like, you're sort of using the institutional cred to like get access to funding and to have like technological infrastructure, for example, like huge radio boards and like sound editing boards and stuff are incredibly expensive. And so it's like, where do you get the money to do that? Well, you sort of do this little game of like trying to shift things around to get people access and to have this sort of broad access to media infrastructures. And then you have these sort of pools of collective decision making, maintaining this sort of uneasy tension between administrative levels and the collective itself. And in our specific case study there, we examine the issue of, I think there was a major corporation, like one of the telecommunications companies, wanting to advertise, and that was an extremely contentious issue, especially for an organization that doesn't get a lot of funding and that can have a lot of even deficits. So it's a really interesting uh, question of like how the community's imaginary ends up conflicting on all these different levels, and there's a lot of different interests involved that have to be mediated, and yet a lot of these organizations last for decades at the same time. So
yeah, it seems like they're very sustainable, but they have a unique kind of mismatch between the imaginary and the actual practices.
which, money can solve a lot of issues, however, so it's still
Yeah,
compelling as a
money and
model.
resources of other
Yeah,
kinds for sure.
yeah.
Um, does someone else have a comment there? Or I thought.
Yeah, so I worked on the other hybrid, which is commercial activist media projects. And with these projects, again, there was usually a commercial structure where they were trying to make money, and it was structured such that there was kind of a possibility to bring in money in a more commercial way. And then there was in media activist practices within that. And so for some of them, that meant that they did media activism off the side of their desk when they were being more funded to do different projects for other organizations. Most of them, the other organizations that they did commercial work for, shared values. So they were other NGOs, nonprofits, or socially minded organizations. The interesting example that is a little bit different than that is a group called Asmina in Brazil. And Asmina is a magazine, an online magazine by an intersectional feminist group in Brazil. They do a lot of work on trans, disability, and racism, and prison. And they did some work on the Zika virus, all kinds of really interesting and controversial issues. Abortion, for example, also very controversial in Brazil. And they noticed when they were doing their presentations or when they were writing and so on, that sometimes larger corporations would approach them and ask them to partner, and they were very uncomfortable with that and said no. But they talked about it, and they decided that they would do commercial contracts for these larger organizations. So they would actually be asked. They were asked one time, can you read over some of our advertising materials, because we want to know how the feminist internet is going to respond to this. So the kind of doing a sensitivity read.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so they did that kind of thing, or they would go into workplaces and do EDI, what we would now call EDI training, trainings on intersectionality and power dynamics and so on. But they had a very fraught relationship with these organizations sometimes, and they would not allow them to do any social media about their presence there, because they didn't share values. So the imaginaries were not shared. And in fact, that was why the organizations needed them in the first place, because there was a gap that they had identified that Asmina had this expertise in. But at the same time, so they're doing that as very separate, their commercial work, from the media activism, the writing that they're doing for their own magazine.
Interesting. And this is very different than having a college or a university funding you. So you have to sort of, I guess, meet these needs that maybe are not necessarily in alignment with your values. What about the workers' cooperatives? Is that this is a slightly different model altogether?
This one, yeah. So media cooperatives was one of the only structures we found that was really. Oops. Oh, yep. That's one of my headphones falling. Oh, sorry. It always does that. So it was one of the only types of organizations we found that had a legal structure. So they're legally structured. We found them predominantly in Spain, Italy, and the Global South, and also in Canada, the UK, actually. So they were pretty widespread. And they decided that they wanted to actually have a formal structure, and that it was a larger group, and they wanted to, again, be sustainable. This would be their job, working in this workers cooperative. Not all of them took that approach. So Radio Bubble was a workers cooperative in Greece, and they actually didn't take in any money whatsoever. They were a radio station that actually the people who were members funded it. So they had to pay a membership fee based on their own capacity to pay. It was very DIY, kind of sliding scale. But I think the most successful example is a group in the UK called Bristol Cable. And when I interviewed them, they were really just getting their start. They had been around for about a year. They've been around for now 10 years, I guess, and they're extremely successful. they're a very large organization now. And when they started out, it was just again, a few people trying to write media that was relevant to the community. And their idea of the cooperative, and most of the cooperatives had like a tiered structure. So it was the people who were the core group. And then there were the sort of peripheral members, and then the broader membership. And everyone at all levels paid their membership dues. It was the same. In some cases, it was 35 euros. Bristol Cable, it was £2 minimum, British pounds, so like under $5
Wow.
to join. I think maybe it started out even being just £1. So it's very minimal membership dues. And then, but the material is available freely to everyone. So it's not just the members who get it. If you pay a different level of membership, you can have it mailed to you. They produce a very beautiful kind of a broadsheet newspaper. And the way that they organized was really interesting, because they went out into communities who they thought would be interested in the thing that they wanted to talk about, and got those people to talk about the issue, whatever it was. So they would go into the Somali community and get Black youth to talk about Black History Month and what are all the problems with it, for example. And then they would give out their newspaper, and then they would use the newspaper to drive people to their website. This is the opposite of most people. Most people use the website to drum up sales on their print material. And so it was a cooperative in the sense that if you were in the cooperative, in the core group, you had to work a certain number of hours a week. It started out being a very low number, something like 10 hours a week. And then but their membership, they don't think of just those people as their membership. Their membership is everyone who pays this £1 a month or more. And they had at the time a couple of I think they had 2,000 members at the time. Now it's much larger, although I couldn't give you a number for that. But so that's the Bristol Cable in Bristol, which is in the UK.
Interesting. And that is, again, different than some of the other more DIY projects that are in the last couple of chapters. So I think, Emily, you're going to tell us a little bit about those.
Yeah. I think originally we had planned to just have DIY, and then we ended up splitting into volunteer-based DIY and autonomous DIY media producers, just based on how kind of the networking between it, which I'll get further into. But DIY media, I feel like we're probably mostly familiar with. This is like very horizontal. There's no funding, often unpaid. I'd say primarily unpaid, kind of more of a labor of love, of like wanting to create something for your community. So an example of that was from Spain, the Cultura Trans, which is a Barcelona-based trans activist group that started with two very close people that were demanding the depathologization of trans and queer identities. And a lot of groups in this also ran into the same of like not wanting to take ads or funding from corporations that they didn't agree with. One of the feminist blogging groups in the autonomous DIY networks also didn't want to take ads for things that their readers couldn't afford, which I thought was very interesting. And autonomous DIY media, these are groups that are usually more widespread, so they're not getting together to meet or throw events. So in the DIY space, Cultura Trans would throw events, they'd have speakers, and then people would donate money to then pay forward for further events, to be able to invite more people, pay for travel. One of the really cool parts about the autonomous DIY media networks was this idea of liberation from labor, and kind of creating their own internal economies. So Media Ninja is a really cool example of that, which is in Brazil, started in 2012. When they were interviewed, it was 19 collective houses where journalists lived together. I think it was over 150 journalists. and the houses were across Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and there would be one person in each house that was responsible for accounts. So people would put the money in that they earned from other labor or from this labor, and then that money would be used for food, leisure, reporting, travel. Another very cool one was Fanzinoteca, which is a fanzine library that operated out of the back of a van and was brought around to communities where they would then have days where somebody would cook food, people would come in, and then they would organize the fanzines together. So it was completely community-based. And that was kind of an interesting one where it was like a networked connection that was also moving around and creating in-person opportunities to work together.
Yeah, by the time we get to these autonomous media networks and the DIY kind of workers, it's really beyond creating. Like creating media is just one precipitate of this much more intimate and everyday kind of activity. That I mean the media ninja sounds like it would actually be a great reality TV show. I'd like to I'd like to watch that. How does that work? What are the conflicts that come up? And what does the community look like? Um, yeah, and one of the things that runs through all of these different models is this sort of question of how to maintain the horizontal organization or the horizontal values, because there's all these different forms of privilege, social, cultural capital that can emerge that create these verticalities, I guess, so to speak. So, um, I don't know. Could some of you say a little bit more about this challenge and how it appears to the different media models, and maybe then how it relates to the imaginaries each of them are trying to uphold? Because this seems to be a really important theme that runs throughout the book.
Yeah, and especially when we're talking about media producers who aren't making money from the production, such as like DIY media, it very much comes down to who has the time and resources to be able to engage in unpaid labor. And usually that is people with more privilege. And so informal hierarchies then start forming of, who is there the most hours, who's able to make the most stories. Yeah, I just want to start off with that.
Yeah, these are not necessarily the ways that we would normally think about kind of, I guess, resources being distributed in an odd or in a non-hierarchical way. So
yeah, and it's also intersectional, right? So people
mm-hmm.
who have more power, privilege, money, time, capacity, both the tangible and the intangible resources will be able to have a voice in media, and those who are overworked because they have to work 3 jobs to make rent, those who are parenting or taking care of older adults in their family, people who have more community obligations and so on, have less capacity and time and money and so on to participate. And so their voices are not being included in the media. And that was one of the kind of tensions with this. It's like they're open to anyone. So you just join by doing, you just show up and do the work, but who has time to do that? And I think a lot of people, not just in the DIY groups that Emily was talking about, but a lot of people talked about, well, if my partner didn't have a full-time job and was covering things, I wouldn't have been able to do this. Or if I like with Athens Live, who Chris talked about, well, if I wasn't living with my parents, I wouldn't be able to do this work. Like I have that privilege. And they were not the only ones who said that. Many people expressed, like, sort of acknowledge this privilege. And then but the key part there is not just acknowledging it, but like, okay, how do we undermine that? How do we mitigate? How do we correct for that? How do we challenge and resist it? How do we find ways to bring people in? So for example, Ricochet Media in Canada, they came up with this idea of an Indigenous reporting fund. And so they specifically did a crowdfunder just for Indigenous reporting. And they used that money to pay Indigenous people to be able to do reporting when most, at the time, now it's different now, but at the time, most of their reporters were not necessarily being paid very much. And so that was how they also made their reporting relevant to Indigenous communities by bringing in Indigenous journalists. So it's one thing to acknowledge that, yeah, intersectionality exists, but what do you do about it? And how do you challenge the power structures of intersectionality?
And
Well,
then,
go ahead, please.
oh, just to add that there's also like intergroup dynamics. So like different sort of structures are also interacting with each other. So for example, if you have like volunteer communities developing like networks within communities, and they're being trusted because they have this sort of like noble purpose and people are sharing stuff with them because of these trust networks. And then you have like entrepreneurial journalists in sort of adjacent to that network. They can sort of siphon information from their connections and then leverage that into economic gain. And this is a very intersectional thing too, where you have a lot of like privilege, like being male or being white, and then being able to go in and scoop people who are more connected with the communities that they're reporting on. And then so you have these sort of also power dynamics between different groups where economics can become a conflict in this sort of like different imaginaries that you're holding of like, well, I got the story and I have access to get some money from this, right? And somebody else might never have that, right? And so then it's like, I think the political economy's focus is like the structures themselves are how you make these imaginaries functional. And if you don't have those structures, well, it's all nice and good to like think about it in a certain way, but what are you doing to actually make sure that people are getting a more equitable distribution of income and access and the intangible resources that make you able to make a life for yourself as a journalist and as a media producer?
Mhm. Yeah, Athens Live had a very interesting, they tried really hard at the beginning to be a horizontal collective, and they found after having long meetings and a lot of interpersonal issues with people that they decided that they just need a board, and they just decided to have 4 people be the board, and those 4 people kind of organized everything, and they found that that seemed to work for them. So it's like all these different typologies, like you each one finds this way that kind of works within the complications and the conflicts, and some people they just like they decided let's default to the old model and we'll still try to focus on social justice, um, you know a social justice emphasis, even though they're not running a horizontal collective. So
Sure.
it's like very interesting.
Well, it seems like whatever, in order for it to be maintained, for it to be sustainable, there has to be that process. There has to be that, that moment where, well, okay, we're running into a problem here. We're noticing this verticality. We need to figure out how to adjust our model. And if they don't, then that's when it kind of runs into the more mortal uh, problems. Um, uh,
And
Another tension. Oh, go ahead.
if I can just add to that, though, is that so we've mentioned burnout a little bit, but what can sometimes happen is that the people most affected, in other words, the ones with the intersectional identities who are trying to create representations that are honest and authentic to their communities, are the ones then who have to do the affective labor, the emotional labor of that fighting to regroup as a horizontal structure and calling out power dynamics and so on. So it creates, like, even though it's a moment where you're trying to reassemble horizontality, it actually
Sure.
creates differential power in the sense of who's actually doing the labor to create that equality. And it's often the people who don't have access to that equality in the first place who have to do the work. And so that was one of the tensions that we found pretty prevalent among many of the, in fact, most of the groups. Some of them were having a much better time at that than others, I would say. But it, and in a way, if I can just go back to how the project started, it was because it was the days of Indymedia, and Indymedia was called out a little bit for being a little bit of a white male dominated alternative media organization. And so people that I was working with and an activist with, we were like, but really the media isn't being made by those guys. Like, if you look at the richness of community media right now, it's very intersectional at its base. And so our objective was to find those projects and talk to those projects and see, because it was women of color, it was people with disabilities, it was Indigenous people who were making all of this very textured and vibrant community-based media, and they were being kind of overshadowed by these, like, sort of larger alternative media groups, and everybody just assumed, well, if Indymedia is doing it that way, that's how all these alternative media groups are working, but it actually wasn't the case. And so we wanted to, like, there's this idea of alternative media as the voice of the voiceless. And we found that it was kind of sometimes the voice of the people who already had voice. And so we wanted to really interrupt that and really look at the voiceless. What are those people doing? And they're actually not voiceless. They actually are creating their own voices in very strong ways, in very particular ways.
And I'm glad you brought up that theme, because it is one that runs throughout the book, and it's a really important dimension of the analysis for people who are interested in thinking about affective labor and talking about the intersectional dimensions of that, especially when we're talking about alternative media production and distribution. That's a really important theme that runs throughout the book. Um, and another tension is the relationship between the use of social media platforms like Facebook in the introduction. And of course, we all know the problems presented by these corporate platforms. They're something that we have to worry about: ownership, surveillance, control. But many of the organizations still sort of find a need to either work with social media or maybe even use it for private Facebook pages. For some reason, show up a lot for internal communication and organization. I was kind of curious if some of these are artifacts of an earlier moment, or if that's still sort of live in the alternative media space, that you have to kind of decide what to do with social media.
Yeah, and also just to kind of, oh, sorry, Chris.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to kind of bridge the effective labor to social media, because especially in the interviews that I ended up reading, there was this interesting situation that women, particularly women of color, were experiencing, where going on to things like Facebook and Twitter, allowed more people to engage with their ideas. That was generally where people could find them, but it was also where a lot of trolling and hate mail came from. And so there ends up also being the effective layer of having to, protect your own humanity when engaging with these sites.
Yeah, and the really serious emotional toll that takes.
Yeah, which has only heightened with bot farms. Sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, it's funny because at the beginning of social media, a lot of these alternative media groups thought like, oh, this is going to save community media. This is going to allow independent media to gain a much larger audience. But then, as we know, the algorithms crept in and that completely changed. And so what a lot, I know Athens Live talked about this, that they hoped that it would be an open source and decentralized. And of course, that is not what's happened when we have platform capture. And now it's a hegemonic structure where the algorithms now are deciding everything for us, and we don't have these groups don't have a lot of say on if their if their content goes viral or not. So it's funny that it began something hopeful and then is turned into like a very constrained and controlling landscape, media landscape.
Yeah,
And
and also having access to their own media production. Like I think just this month, for Pride Month, Instagram went and took down a whole bunch of queer Instagram pages for hate speech or other absolute nonsense claims. And then you might just completely lose access to an entire archive, possibly years of work. Especially, yeah, when it comes to like internal Facebook communications, and that kind of thing.
yeah, and that happened to some groups actually that we interviewed where they had whole wikis set up and all these resources that they maybe didn't pay a membership fee or something and then lost access to. And so there were people aware of that even at that time, that they were very critical of like Google even having things on Google Docs and like stuff like that in terms of like a loss of access. God, but oh Jesus. But yeah. But then at that time there was a lot of hope around social media because it was more open at that time as they were still trying to draw people in, right? Because of course access and distribution is the draw of the platform economies, right? So, oh, you can go viral, you can get all these people, and then of course once they've sort of like captured the market, then we start closing down and trying to make sort of more economic pipelines for the people running the networks, because of course you can't run these huge multimedia corporations without income, and there's just the models of like how things operate on that scale means that that is just inevitable to some degree. But that part of our discussion of the particular value of looking at this point in time in media organization is this necessity for in-person communications and in-person networks, and the vitality of that, especially as you get these sort of algorithmic clampdowns and mass media surveillance and all of this stuff, is that what sort of can get around or escape that or stand against that is still in-person contact, is still creating the resilience of communities that are not only creating media, but also caring. I mean, why are you creating the media? It's because something is happening to you. It's because you need something or not having something or something cool is happening and you want that to spread and you want to get those messages out there. And so, yeah, it's like this return to personal communications and not relying on these intermediaries to store all of your information, to have all of your communications going through these channels.
That sort of gets at what maybe what we have the last question here, which is that a lot of those, as you're kind of hinting, the studies that you are talking about here, the interviews, these models, a lot of these were earlier in the 2010s, uh, which was a different moment of media ecology. And in the introduction, you kind of say that it's valuable to look at this moment and to kind of see what was going on, but we are in a new moment. The algorithms are different. The ownership structures. I mean, probably even since you turned in your manuscript, the ownership structures of these media platforms and values of them have shifted dramatically. So, what are the valuable lessons to take from these models? I guess you're suggesting one is that it's good to be in person as well, but are there other things to kind of take from this?
Yeah, I also think like definitely the in-person portion, and the like looking to who you're getting your media from, because we're now in the time of big slop, and it can
Yes.
be hard to find good actual information from your community about your community, and so like finding out who the people are in your community that are recording this, that are experiencing it, and then getting your information directly from them instead of multiple intermediaries of like a conglomerate and an algorithm. And it's, sorry, I'm trying to not go into any sort of LLM territory.
Yeah, for now. Well, and maybe providing support to those who are helping you get that information, because it seems like that's another important feature. If they're willing to take money, which it seems like some of them that in itself is a bit of a non-starter because it creates conflicts in itself. But we have to support the media that is going to support us.
Yeah, and food is always a great option.
There you go. There you go.
I think that one of the things that we started out with in the Marge project and also with this book is wanting to create a kind of user manual for how to start a media group. If you're a small group of people, 2 or more, and you think, and you're interested in making media, you have some skills or not, you can work on your skills. But you have something to say, you have a community issue that you want to represent. How can you structure that in ways that are consistent with your media imaginaries, your objectives in creating media? And this provides a clear roadmap of 6 different ways that you can think about alternative media. So if you're really opposed to, you have a job, it's enough to sustain you and you're doing this on the side, you'd go into DIY media and maybe DIY media networks and see what those folks are doing and how they organize their work. And if you just graduated from journalism school and you want to start some kind of a media group, like a company, I don't know how else to put that, an organization, let's say. It doesn't need to be corporate, but maybe you want to do a media co-op, maybe you want to be a critical entrepreneurialism journalism startup, right? So it gives you some springboard, starting off,
Sure.
starting points for thinking about how you might go about doing that. And also it maps out a lot of the contradictions and tensions, like almost like a do's and don'ts. So it's not, we don't simplify it in that way, but I guess we could. But we're just hoping that it's really useful to anyone today who wants to make media and doesn't really know how to structure it, to be able to think through what are some of the ins and outs of different ways of structuring a media project, or do I want to just be a solo entrepreneurial journalist? So that's one that we didn't include in the book because we were looking at structures, and a structure of one is not really a structure with any power dynamics that we look at.
Sure.
So we did interview some people like that, but they didn't make it into the book, and I'm sorry to those people. But yeah, we were more interested in looking at the dynamics. And I think one of the things that IO was pointing to around the in-person meetings, one of the things that many of the groups talked about was the social relationships, and the social relationships that helped them to understand what was going on in the community that they were a part of, but also that supported their day-to-day life, the community dinners, the solidarity parties where they would do fundraisers for whatever it was their community needed at that time. And how all of those kind of intangible community relationships were really important in terms of grounding the media, in terms of what they could write about, but also just in terms of feeling supported on a not just a material level, but an affective level, on a personal level, a community level, and so on, so that their work was grounded within that. And so some of the groups would even they would be an online only group, and they would meet once a month just to talk about stuff. They would have a chat group that was open all the time, and they could talk about relationship trouble, or one person, their car broke down, so they go on the group
Sure.
chat, or like, I need a ride, my car's broken down, I'm new in the country, I don't know what I'm doing, right? So it's really the in-person organizing gives you that space that's a kind of more, I don't want to say safer space, a more grounded space from which to make media.
Sure. And a community who's sort of helping you do it. Sorry, Chris, what were you going to say?
Oh, I was just seconding what Sandra was saying there, that the importance of community, and just it's funny that a lot of there seems to be a lot of young people now are starting to go against technology, getting flip phones, and like going back to playing vinyl records, and so there seems to be a bit of resistance against, like, and I hope that becomes a snowball effect where young people
Sure.
start being, this communicating over text and or over Facebook and TikTok isn't quite working. Maybe let's actually come together and like hang out again. Like, I think a lot of people are still suffering from the antisocial effects of the pandemic. And so I think that the time is now. Let's get together and chat and hang out, and don't even have to do very much. Just like enjoy each other's company.
Well, I agree completely, although I do appreciate being able to meet with you all today virtually, and letting you all tell us all about these projects. Another thing to note is that this is a truly global investigation. That there are projects that you look at from all over Europe and the global South. So it's a really useful and important document for people to check out. So I really appreciate you all joining us today to chat about it. So thanks.
Thank you very much.
Next week, we're going to be talking with Hill Malatino about his new book, Climbing. So if you're joining us on YouTube, it'll be streaming there again. And this episode will be available on the Breaking Culture Live YouTube channel later today. So please share it with your colleagues and let us know if you have any ideas for future episodes or invitees by emailing us at breakingculturelive@gmail.com. So thanks again for joining us. I'm Sean Johnson Andrews. Please check out my Substack at breakingculture.substack.com. So until next time, take care.